Dear listeners, welcome to today's session, to the Kingdom's Rebirth, an ancient Indian story. In this tale of power, loyalty, and sacrifice, a kingdom on the brink of collapse fights to survive amidst rebellion, betrayal, and foreign invaders. Join us as we follow the journey of Lucian and Aeliana, siblings bound by duty as they face impossible choices to secure the future of their kingdom. Stay with us as we dive into this epic story of resilience and the dawn of a new era. Let's start the journey. The day the kingdom fell began like any other. The sun rose, casting its first light over the sprawling lands of Itharia, a land once marked by peace, prosperity, and the enduring presence of the ancient royal family. Its majestic citadel sat high on a mountain peak, overlooking a kingdom that had flourished for centuries under the careful rule of the House of Vale, one of the oldest bloodlines in all of known history. But beneath the beauty of Itharia's golden fields, the lush forests, and the rivers that glittered like silver veins through the land, there were cracks, imperceptible at first, but deepening with each passing day. King Lucian Vale, the reigning monarch of Itharia, stood on the balcony of his palace, gazing out over the kingdom. His aging eyes reflected a weariness that had settled in his heart over the past few years. Despite his youth, his shoulders carried the burden of leadership, and the pressure of maintaining peace had taken its toll. The kingdom he had inherited was changing, its people restless, its enemies ever more brazen in their ambitions. They, once proud kingdom, was now on the cusp of something darker, and Lucian knew it. The seeds of revolution had been sown long before his father's passing, and now the harvest was upon them. "Your Majesty," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Lord Aldrich, his trusted advisor, who approached with a scroll in hand. The man had been by his side for many years, a wise and loyal servant of the crown. Lucian turned, his face a mask of concern as he looked at his old friend. "What news, Aldrich?" Lucian asked, his voice heavy with anticipation. Lord Aldrich's face was pale, his expression tense. "It is the Darnathians, Your Majesty. They've crossed the southern border. We've received reports of their raiding parties, torching villages, and the southern watchtower was taken late last night. They're moving toward the heart of Itharia." Lucian's heart sank. The Darnathians, a fierce and warlike tribe from the distant east, had been Itharia's allies once, but the kingdom's relations with them had soured over the years. For decades, peace had been maintained by careful diplomacy and the threat of force, but with the rise of the Darnathian chieftain Sargon, the balance had shifted. Sargon was known for his brutality, and his ambition was unchecked by any sense of restraint. "We should have seen this coming," Lucian muttered under his breath. "I should have seen it coming." Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "Your Majesty, there is still time to rally the army and drive them back. If we act swiftly, we can contain the threat before it spreads." But Lucian knew better. The Darnathians were not merely raiders, they were invaders. They had not crossed the border simply to plunder and pillage. They had come for something far more dangerous, the heart of Itharia itself. For generations, the Vale family had ruled over a land that was rich in magic, with ancient secrets buried deep within its soil. Those secrets were coveted by many, and the Darnathians were no exception. Lucian's thoughts turned to the ancient relics his family had guarded for centuries, relics that were said to possess powers beyond comprehension. He feared that Sargon had learned of them, and that the Darnathian chieftain had come to claim them. Lucian's mind raced as he thought of his people. War was inevitable, but a war with the Darnathians would bring devastation, not just to Itharia's borders, but to its very soul. The kingdom had long been fragile, its political alliances in disarray, its economy strained by years of neglect and bad harvests. War would only accelerate the kingdom's collapse. "Prepare the army," Lucian commanded, his voice suddenly firm. "We will meet them at the southern pass." but gather the council as well. I need advice from every corner of the kingdom. We are about to face an enemy unlike any we have ever known." Lord Aldrich bowed his head and turned to leave, but Lucian stopped him. "And Aldrich," he added, his tone softer, "find my sister Aeliana. She must be informed. She must prepare for what is to come." The advisor hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and hurried off. Lucian remained on the balcony, staring out at the distant mountains where the first signs of the Darnathian invasion were beginning to show. Smoke rising in the distance, the faint sound of battle reaching his ears. In the heart of the palace, Queen Arya Vale paced nervously in her chambers. The news of the invasion had reached her, and she could not sit still. Her husband, King Lucian's father, had died suddenly 2 years ago, leaving Lucian as the sole ruler. Though Lucian was a capable king, his mother knew how ill-prepared he was for the challenges he faced. She had feared for his safety, knowing that his idealism and compassion would be tested in ways he could not foresee. Now, those fears were becoming reality. Arya knew that the kingdom was on the edge of disaster. The Darnathians were a formidable enemy, and they had come for more than just land. They had come for the ancient relics hidden beneath the kingdom's soil. Those relics were not just artifacts of power. They were the key to the kingdom's very survival. If they fell into the wrong hands, Ithariel would be lost forever. As Arya paced, her thoughts turned to her children, Lucian's younger sister, Aeliana, and her own son Baron. Aeliana was only 17, but she had always been an astute and capable young woman. Her sharp mind and her knowledge of Itharian politics would serve the kingdom well. Arya only hoped she would be able to keep Aeliana safe when the war began. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was Aeliana, her face drawn with worry. "Mother, what is happening? I've heard the news. Are we really at war?" Arya sighed, her eyes softening as she looked at her daughter. "Yes, my dear. War has come to Ithariel." Alina's eyes flashed. "With determination. Then we fight, don't we? We have no choice but to fight." Arya shook her head, a shadow crossing her face. "It's not just a fight for survival, Aeliana. This is something much darker. The Darnathians are after something more than just land. They seek the ancient relics of our ancestors, the very power that holds Ithariel together." Alina's brow furrowed. "But why now? Why after all these years?" "Because the time has come," Arya whispered, "and we must be ready. The kingdom depends on us." Later that day, as Lucian stood before the royal council, he was faced with the grim reality of what lay ahead. Lords and ladies from across the kingdom had gathered in the war room, each one offering their counsel, but Lucian could see the fear in their eyes. The kingdom was divided, its people fractured, and its military weakened by years of neglect. How could they stand against the Darnathians, who had united under Sargon's brutal leadership? The southern border has fallen, Lord Gavriel, one of the kingdom's most seasoned generals, said grimly. "We cannot wait any longer. We must move our forces now, before the Darnathians advance further into the kingdom." Lucian nodded, his expression dark. "But we cannot fight them in the open field. The Darnathians are skilled in warfare, and their numbers are too great. We must force them into a position where we have the advantage. The southern pass is narrow and defensible. We will fight. There." Aeliana, who had entered the room quietly and stood at her brother's side, spoke up. "What of the relics, brother? Have we heard anything of their intentions? We cannot fight for land alone. The Darnathians are here for something greater." Lucian looked at his sister, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "I know," he replied. "I fear they will not stop until they have everything." The council fell silent. Lucian's mind was clouded with doubt, but his resolve hardened. Ithariel had stood for centuries, and it would not fall now. The war was inevitable. The Darnathians were coming, and Itharia was unprepared. Lucian Vale knew the path ahead would lead to bloodshed, to sacrifice, and to choices that would define the future of his kingdom. But as he gazed out at the sunset that bathed the land in golden light, he swore one thing. He would not let Itharia fall without a fight. The sun had barely set as Lucian stood in the great hall of the citadel, his eyes tracing the intricate stone carvings of past monarchs. The hall, with its towering pillars and vaulted ceiling, was a monument to the glory of his ancestors. But now it felt like a tomb, empty, haunted by the echoes of a bygone era. The weight of the impending war hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Lucian could feel the tension in his muscles, a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. Before him, the royal council was gathered, each member more concerned with their own survival than the future of Itharia. The nobles, the military commanders, and his closest advisors sat in silence, all eyes on the king. Lord Aldrich, his most trusted counselor, stood at Lucian's side, his expression grave. The man's once dark hair had grayed in recent years, but his sharp mind remained undimmed. Lucian had known Aldrich since childhood, and the bond between them was one of mutual respect, forged through countless trials. "My king," Aldrich began, his voice steady, "the Darnathians are a formidable enemy, but they are not invincible. We have the advantage of terrain, and with the right strategy, we can push them back. We need to move swiftly and decisively." Lucian nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were consumed by the invasion, yes, but more by the secret his family had kept hidden for generations, the ancient relics buried deep within Itharia. The Darnathians were not merely raiders. They were after something far more dangerous, a power that lay buried beneath the kingdom's soil. "The southern pass is our best chance," Lucian said, finally breaking the silence. "We will fortify it, hold the line, and force them to fight on our terms. But Aldrich is right. We cannot afford to be passive. We must strike first." The council murmured in agreement, but there was an undercurrent of doubt that Lucian could not ignore. The war was already spiraling out of control, and the kingdom was divided in ways that made it almost impossible to form a united front. The nobles of Itharia had grown complacent over the years, more concerned with their own petty power struggles than the defense of the kingdom. The economic crisis, the growing unrest among the common people, and the lack of a solid military structure had left Itharia vulnerable to the Darnathian threat. Lady Aeliana, a fierce and shrewd noblewoman from the eastern reaches of the kingdom, spoke up. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice sharp, "I agree with Lord Aldrich. We must strike, but we must also consider our internal struggles. The people are restless. If we march south to face the Darnathians, the rebellions in the northern cities will only grow. We cannot afford to divide our forces." Aeliana's words struck a chord with Lucian. The kingdom was on the brink of internal collapse. For years, the common people had suffered under the heavy weight of taxes, poor harvests, and a crumbling economy. The noble class had grown rich at the expense of the poor, and resentment had spread like a wildfire. The flames of rebellion had been sparked long ago, and Lucian feared that if the people of Itharia rose up in revolt, they would burn the kingdom to the ground. "We cannot fight a war on two fronts," Lucian said, his voice tight with frustration. "I understand the risks, Lady Aeliana, but we cannot ignore the Darnathians at our gates. The relics must be kept from them at all costs. We cannot let them gain access to that power." The room fell into a tense silence. The relics were an ancient secret that Lucian had kept hidden from the public eye. For generations, the royal family had protected the secrets of Itharia's past, guarding the sacred objects that were said to possess great magical power. These relics were not mere artifacts. They were key to the kingdom's survival. And Lucian knew that if the Darnathians obtained them, the world would be plunged into darkness. "I understand your concerns," Lucian continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But we are out of time. We will fight. We will fortify the southern pass, and we will defend Itharia with everything we have. But we must also consider the long-term consequences. The relics must be protected, not just from the Darnathians, but from anyone who would use them for their own gain." Outside the citadel walls, in the cold, shadowed halls of the palace, Aeliana Vale stood at the edge of her balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on the distant mountain range that bordered Itharia. From this vantage point, she could see the great spires of the palace, the streets of Arianagar, and the sprawling fields beyond. But it was the distant shadow of the southern pass that captured her attention. The Darnathians were coming. She could feel it in her bones. Aeliana had always known that Itharia's fragile peace could not last forever. The kingdom was divided, its people divided, and its leadership, her brother Lucian, was burdened with the weight of the crown. But even more troubling was the truth she had uncovered, the ancient relics hidden beneath Itharia. The relics that her father had always spoken of in whispers, the relics that Lucian had vowed to protect at all costs. Aeliana had always been her brother's confidant, the one person he trusted above all others. But as the years had passed, she had come to understand more than Lucian realized. She had studied the kingdom's ancient texts, the forbidden scrolls that had been passed down through the generations. She knew that the relics were more than just symbols of power. They were the heart of Itharia itself. Without them, the kingdom would fall. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find her mother, Queen Arya, standing in the doorway, her expression filled with concern. "Aeliana," Arya said softly, her voice heavy with the weight of years spent in the service of the crown. "Lucian is preparing for war. You must be ready." Aeliana turned to face her mother, her eyes cold and unreadable. "I am ready, Mother. I have always been ready." Arya stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "You know what this means, don't you? War will change everything. The relics must be kept safe. You must help your brother." Elena's gaze softened, but her resolve remained unbroken. "I will do whatever is necessary to protect Itharia, but I will not follow blindly. Lucian is a good king, but he is not infallible. I have my own role to play in this." As the days passed, the kingdom of Itharia was consumed by the storm that had long been brewing. War had come to their doorstep, and the Darnathians were not the only threat they faced. The kingdom was torn apart by internal strife, political intrigue, and the looming question of who would control the ancient relics. As the southern pass became the focal point of their struggle, Lucian, Aeliana, and their allies would be forced to confront not just an external enemy, but the dark forces within their own kingdom. The storm was coming, and with it, the dawn of a new era. But for Itharia, it was uncertain whether that dawn would bring salvation or the end of everything they had once known. The first light of dawn broke across the kingdom of Itharia, casting long shadows over the fortress-like walls of Arianagar. Within the citadel's war room, a tense silence had settled over the gathered council. Maps were spread across the heavy wooden table, their edges worn from constant study, their ink fading in some places from years of use. The kingdom, once a symbol of peace, now felt like a powder keg, ready to ignite at the slightest provocation. Lucian Vale stood at the head of the table, his dark hair damp with sweat from the long hours of deliberation, his brow furrowed as his gaze swept over the faces of his council, each member a representative of the kingdom's last line of defense. The gravity of their situation hung in the air, thick and oppressive. They had already lost the southern border. The Darnathians, led by the brutal Sargon, were relentless. Their war bands like a swarm of locusts sweeping through the fields and villages. The invasion was no longer just a border skirmish. It was a full-scale war. Your Majesty, we've sent word to every garrison and fort. Lord Gavriel, the commander of Itharia's military, said, his voice steady despite the urgency in his eyes. But the southern forces are already retreating. If we don't take action immediately, we risk losing all the land below the pass. Lucian nodded, his gaze fixed on the maps before him. The southern region, with its fertile fields and strategically significant mountain passes, was essential to Itharia's economy and defense. If they lost it, the entire kingdom would be exposed to the Darnathians' brutal march inland. But there were more pressing matters at hand. Prepare the troops, Lord Gavriel, Lucian said, his voice unwavering despite the growing turmoil. Within him, we will not abandon the southern cities. The Darnathians must not breach the pass. I want the northern and western legions to hold their positions. We cannot risk any more movement from them. Gavriel nodded curtly, taking his leave to begin coordinating the military efforts. Lucian turned to the rest of the council, his mind already racing to the next concern. Lady Alara. Lucian addressed the noblewoman from the east, her sharp eyes. Never leaving him. What of the people? If war breaks out across the kingdom, the city will descend into chaos. What are we doing to maintain order? Alara, who had been unusually quiet throughout the discussion, responded with a steady voice. The people are already restless, Your Majesty. The nobility holds the power, but the common folk have begun to see their plight more clearly. They want change. We will need to use force to suppress any uprisings. There are rumors of secret groups in the northern regions and whispers of rebellion. Lucian felt a pang of unease at her words. The noble class of Itharia had grown fat and complacent, while the common people starved and struggled. This was the very thing his father had warned him about, how a divided kingdom could easily fall prey to external threats. Then we'll need to ensure we keep control over the people, Lucian said, his voice hardening. But we cannot afford to crush their spirit entirely. The rebellion will have to be quelled, but we must also address the root causes. Aldrich, any word from the Council of the Wise? Lord Aldrich, Lucian's most trusted advisor, stepped forward, his gray beard falling to his chest as he spoke. The council has been disjointed, Your Majesty. The fear of the Darnathian threat has overshadowed the more delicate matters. But we have learned that the Darnathians are after more than just land. Their warbands are raiding with purpose. There are rumors that they seek the ancient relics. The room fell silent. Lucian's breath caught in his throat. He had feared this moment, the knowledge that the Darnathians had not come merely to conquer, but to seize the very heart of Itharia's power. The relics, Lucian muttered, but the relics are hidden. They cannot possibly know where they are. I fear they do, Your Majesty, Aldrich replied, his voice heavy with unease. The Darnathians have more knowledge than we anticipated. Sargon, their leader, is no ordinary chieftain. His spies are everywhere. They must have uncovered the secrets of our ancestors. Lucian clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. The relics, artifacts of unimaginable power, were the very heart of Itharia's strength. They were kept hidden deep beneath the royal citadel, sealed away by his ancestors to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. The power of the relics was said to be vast, capable of shaping the very fabric of magic itself. But they were not simply magic. They were ancient, rooted in the history of Itharia, and their loss would spell the kingdom's doom. We cannot let them have the relics, Lucian said, his voice low but resolute. We must keep them hidden, no matter the cost. But we cannot fight this war alone. We need allies. He turned to Aeliana, who had remained silent in the corner of the room, her arms crossed as she watched her brother with sharp eyes. Lucian had always known that Aeliana was more than just the princess. She was a force of nature, as clever as she was fierce, and her intellect often surpassed that of the council's oldest members. "Aeliana," Lucian said, his voice softening, "you know the politics of Itharia better than anyone. If we are to survive this, we will need to forge alliances with the kingdoms beyond our borders. Can you make contact with the southern lords and the Darren tribes? If we do not stand united, we will fall." Aeliana nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I will start with the Darren. Their warriors could turn the tide of this war, but they will demand a price. We will need to give them something in exchange." "I know," Lucian replied, "but we have little choice now. It is either we act swiftly and secure alliances, or we risk losing the kingdom." As the council dispersed, Lucian remained at the table, his mind spinning with the magnitude of their situation. He had always known that his reign would be challenging, but he had not anticipated the weight of it, the weight of history, of legacy, and of the very kingdom that rested on his shoulders. That evening, after the war room had emptied, Lucian walked alone to the balcony of his private chambers. The city stretched out beneath him, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. He could hear the distant clamor of preparations for war, the sound of soldiers marching, blacksmiths forging weapons, and the relentless rhythm of a kingdom that knew it was on the brink of collapse. He thought of the relics again, his family's secret, the power that had been passed down through generations, the power that could save Itharia or destroy it. It was a dangerous gamble, and Lucian wasn't sure if he was ready to risk everything on a gamble that might not even pay off. Suddenly, a soft voice behind him interrupted his thoughts. "Brother," Aeliana said, stepping onto the balcony, her footsteps silent on the stone. "You're still thinking about the relics, aren't you?" Lucian turned to face her. "Yes. I fear that if the Darnathians gain access to them, it will be the end of us. And I'm not sure we can stop them." Aeliana placed a hand on his shoulder. "Lucian, you are not alone in this. I will stand by you no matter what happens. But we cannot protect everything forever. We will need to act, and we will need to act swiftly." Lucian sighed deeply, feeling the weight of her words. "I know, Aeliana, but I fear the consequences of the choices we're about to make." She smiled faintly. "That's what makes you a king. But remember, sometimes it is the darkest hours that reveal the brightest light." The gathering storm of war had begun, and Itharia stood on the precipice of its greatest test. With the Darnathians marching toward the kingdom's heart, the Vale family's legacy would either be shattered in the flames of conflict or forged anew in the crucible of battle. But Lucian knew one thing. The choices they made now would echo through the ages, for better or for worse. And the relics, ancient and dangerous, would play a role in the kingdom's fate, whether they were kept hidden or lost to the world forever. The first whispers of dawn had barely reached the citadel when Lucian Vale was already at the war table, his brow furrowed in concentration. The war room was dimly lit by flickering candles, the flickering light casting long shadows over the walls. Maps of the southern border and the surrounding regions were spread out before him, and the air was thick with the smell of parchment and ink. The silence was oppressive, filled only by the faint scratching of quills and the murmurs of his closest advisors. "Your Majesty," Lord Gavriel's deep voice broke the silence. "We have received word that the Darnathians have begun to mobilize for a larger offensive. They are not stopping at the southern cities. They're pushing towards the capital itself. Our forces are outnumbered 2-1. Lucian's fingers gripped the edge of the table. His mind raced, but his face remained stoic. The Darnathians, led by their bloodthirsty chieftain Sargon, had proven relentless in their assault. What began as a skirmish at the border had rapidly escalated into a full-scale invasion. Lucian had been forced to marshal every available soldier, but he feared it would not be enough. "We cannot hold the line at the southern pass much longer," Lucian said, his voice low but firm. "We must act before they can breach our defenses. Lord Gavriel, what is the status of the southern legions?" Gavriel's face grew tight with concern. "They are holding strong, but our reinforcements are slow to arrive. The terrain is difficult, and the Darnathians have proven to be more organized than we anticipated. We're losing ground, Your Majesty." Lucian nodded, his thoughts turning toward the capital. If the Darnathians broke through the southern pass, there would be nothing between them and Aeliana. The kingdom's last bastion of hope would fall. Aeliana, who had been quietly listening from her place beside Lucian, spoke up. Her sharp gaze never left the map as she considered their options. "Lucian," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We need more than just military force. We need allies, and we need them now. If we fight the Darnathians alone, we will be crushed. The kingdom's factions must be united, or we will lose everything." Lucian turned to face her, meeting her gaze with a mixture of both admiration and concern. "I agree, but our alliances have always been fragile. The lords of the eastern and northern territories are already beginning to question my leadership. They see a king on the verge of defeat, and they are already preparing for their own survival. If we cannot gain their loyalty now, they will turn against us." Elena's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind already working on the problem. "Then we must make them an offer they can't refuse. The Darren tribes in the north, the lords of the east, the southern merchant guilds, these factions must be brought to the table. We cannot afford to be divided." The urgency in her voice was palpable. Lucian understood her point well. The nobles of Itharia had long been at odds, their power struggles only further fracturing an already fragile kingdom. But now, with war at their doorstep, the reality of their situation was undeniable. If they did not stand united, they would fall. What of the Darren tribes? Lord Aldrich interjected, his voice low but urgent. "They are formidable, yes, but they do not trust us. The Darren chieftains have their own ambitions. We would need to offer them something of equal value. Their loyalty comes at a cost." Aeliana turned to Aldrich, her expression fierce. "Then let us offer them what they want. Land, resources, a seat at the council, whatever it takes. We cannot fight this war without them." Lucian looked between his sister and his council, the weight of the decision pressing on him like a 100-ton stone. He knew his sister was right. The Darren tribe's warriors could tip the balance of this war, but giving them land and influence would mean compromising Itharia's sovereignty, a cost Lucian was not sure he could bear. "We will send emissaries to the Darren tribes," Lucian decided, his voice resolute. "If they are to be our allies, we will make them an offer they cannot refuse. But we must tread carefully. The loyalty of the other factions is equally important. Lady Alara, I will need you to ensure the support of the Eastern Lords. Work your influence. And Lord Gavriel, prepare the Southern forces for a major offensive." Alara, her eyes cold and calculating, inclined her head. "Understood, Your Majesty. I will make the necessary arrangements." Aeliana remained silent for a moment, her gaze distant. Lucian could see the wheels turning in her mind, and he knew that she was already planning ahead. Her instincts were sharper than anyone's. Later that day, as the sun began to dip behind the distant mountains, Lucian stood alone on the balcony of his chambers, overlooking the kingdom. The streets of Aeliana were already stirring with unrest. People whispered in hushed tones, fearing the arrival of the Darnathian warbands. The nobility, too, were restless, afraid of what the future might hold for them. His thoughts turned to the ancient relics, those objects of power that his ancestors had safeguarded for centuries. If the Darnathians learned of them, they could tip the scales in their favor. Lucian had kept the location of the relics a closely guarded secret, but he knew that Sargon's spies were already at work. It was only a matter of time before the Darnathians would seek them out. He turned back to the war room, his mind heavy, with the burden of leadership. His people, his kingdom, and the future of Itharia all rested on his shoulders. The choices he made now would define his reign, and perhaps the fate of the world. As he walked into the war room, his gaze met Aeliana's. She was already working, organizing the diplomatic efforts and preparing for the uncertain road ahead. Lucian could see the determination in her eyes. She had always been his rock, the one person who never wavered in her resolve. "Aeliana," Lucian said, his voice quieter now. "I fear we are racing against time. If we cannot secure the loyalty of the northern and eastern lords, we will face the Darnathians alone. And that will not end well." Aeliana's lips parted slightly, her expression hardening with the gravity of his words. "We will not let Itharia fall, brother, no matter the cost." As the days wore on, the tension in the citadel reached a fever pitch. The emissaries had left to negotiate with the Darren tribes, and Lady Alara had already begun her efforts with the eastern lords. The air in Aeliana was thick with anticipation. Every corner of the city buzzed with the murmur of rumors, and the common folk eyed the walls with growing fear. The first wave of Darnathian warbands had already reached the southern pass, and the fortifications were holding for now. But Lucian knew that their fate was hanging by a thread. The kingdom's future depended not only on military strength, but on the unity of its people and the cunning of its leaders. Yet, even as the storm of war gathered on the horizon, there were darker forces at play, forces that Lucian could not yet see, but which were already shaping the fate of Itharia. The relics, hidden deep within the royal citadel, would soon be at the center of the struggle, and with them, the very balance of power in the world. The days following Lucian's decision to pursue alliances were filled with a frenzied energy. The southern legions, despite their losses, were regrouping, preparing for what promised to be a brutal defense. As the city of Aeliana became a hive of activity, emissaries from the northern and eastern territories arrived with promises of aid, some genuine, others wrapped in veiled threats and demands. The prospect of alliances was fragile, and Lucian knew better than to trust any of them fully. For all the political maneuvering, there were deeper games being played behind the scenes. At the heart of the citadel, Lucian and Aeliana convened, with the royal council in a dimly lit chamber that had once been used for diplomatic negotiations in times of peace. The stone walls, lined with ancient tapestries depicting Itharia's early conquests, seemed almost oppressive now. Every face around the table was drawn tight with concern, but there was something more in the air, a sense of impending disaster. "Lucian, the Darren tribes are cautious but intrigued," Lady Alara said, her voice sharp as she glanced over the latest reports. "They demand a heavy price for their loyalty. They want the fertile lands to the north, where the wheat grows in abundance. They also want a say in the kingdom's future leadership." Alina's brow furrowed at Alara's words. "A say in leadership? They want a seat at the throne? We cannot allow Itharia to fall under the rule of these tribes." Alara raised a hand to silence her. "I did not say that, but they want control of the northern trade routes, and they'll need a promise of protection for their people. Their warriors are fierce, but they are not fond of the southern elites, and they distrust the nobility." Lucian leaned forward, his mind spinning. "We cannot afford to antagonize them. If we promise them the land, they might be swayed. But if we backtrack on our word later, they will turn against us in an instant. We need them, Aeliana. Our survival depends on their strength." Alina's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Something darker? Something she did not yet want to voice. "You don't trust them." "No, I don't," Lucian said bluntly. "But we have no choice. The Darnathians are advancing faster than we expected. If the Darren tribes hold the north, and the Eastern Lords lend their support, we might just have a chance. But we must also deal with the rebellion within our own borders. Aelina's eyes narrowed. Rebellion? Lucian's face hardened as he glanced at Aldrich, who had been quietly observing the exchange. The elder advisor cleared his throat before speaking, his tone grave. We've intercepted several messages from the northern cities. The common people, especially in the cities of Nevria and Dreth, have started to form insurgent groups. They speak of overthrowing the monarchy, of taking control from the nobles who have hoarded resources for too long. The unrest is spreading, like wildfire, and if we don't address it soon, it will engulf the kingdom. The room fell into silence, the weight of Aldrich's words sinking in. The kingdom that Lucian had been entrusted to rule, a kingdom that had once been unified under the House of Vale, was now at the edge of civil war. Even as the Darnathians approached from the south, a fire raged within the heart of Itharia itself. The nobles were too distracted by their own power struggles to notice the growing storm of rebellion, until it was too late. Later that evening, as the last embers of the day faded into the inky black of night, Lucian stood at the edge of his private balcony, gazing out over the kingdom. The city of Arianagar below him seemed calm, but he knew better. The tensions that simmered in the streets were about to explode. He thought about the ancient relics, hidden deep beneath the citadel, locked away in the vaults that had been passed down through generations of his family. His ancestors had sealed them away for a reason. They were powerful, yes, but dangerous. In the wrong hands. Lucian could feel the weight of his family's secret pressing against him, and he wondered if they were ready to face the consequences of that power being unleashed. He had always known that the day would come when the relics would become a central part of the kingdom's survival, but he had never imagined it would come so soon. A soft sound behind him broke his reverie. He turned to see Aeliana standing in the doorway of his chambers, her face bathed in the pale light of the moon. She didn't speak immediately, but he could sense her unease. She had been watching him more closely than ever in recent days, as if she were waiting for him to make a mistake. "Aeliana," Lucian said, his voice softer now. "What is it?" She stepped into the room, her gaze sharp but tinged with concern. "Lucian, I've been thinking." "About what?" he asked, bracing himself for her response. "The relics. We both know that if the Darnathians gain access to them, it will be the end of everything," Aeliana said quietly, her voice betraying her own apprehension. "But what if they don't stop at the relics? What if they use them to control the kingdom, and everyone in it?" Lucian turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "You're worried about more than just the Darnathians, aren't you?" Aeliana didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out over the city, her mind clearly turning over the situation with the precision of a seasoned strategist. "Lucian, there are forces within our own kingdom that want to use the relics for themselves. They don't care about the people, about Itharia's future. All they care about is power." Lucian clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise within him. He knew she was right. The nobles were not united, and many of them had their own agendas. Some wanted the relics for themselves. Some wanted to control the kingdom by any means necessary. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that even the Darnathians might be a lesser threat compared to the internal divisions that had been allowed to fester for so long. "I'll take care of the Darnathians," Lucian said, his voice firm. "But I can't do this alone, Aeliana. I need you to watch over the council, to ensure that we don't lose ourselves in the politics of power. If the nobles are too distracted with their petty infighting, we will all fall. We need to keep them focused on the common goal, surviving this war." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. When she found none, she nodded, a grim determination settling over her features. "I will, Lucian. But remember, there are forces you cannot control. There are forces in the shadows, even among your own allies, who will stop at nothing to see this kingdom torn apart. As the days passed, the kingdom of Itharia stood on the edge of a precipice. The war with the Darnathians loomed large, and the rebellion within the kingdom's borders threatened to consume everything Lucian and Aeliana had worked for. Their alliances were tenuous, their enemies numerous, and their relics, those ancient. And dangerous artifacts remained at the heart of the struggle for power. But Lucian was not without hope. He had the loyalty of his sister, the strength of his military commanders, and the courage of a king determined to protect his people. The path ahead would be fraught with danger, but Lucian was resolved to lead Itharia through its darkest hour. For if the kingdom fell, there would be no future, no legacy left to carry forward. The sound of boots echoed through the cold stone halls of the citadel as Lucian walked toward the council chambers. The day had been long, filled with frantic meetings, intelligence reports, and an endless stream of advisors all clamoring for his attention. His mind was heavy, burdened not just by the growing threat of the Darnathians, but by the internal fractures that threatened to tear the kingdom apart from within. The nobles, once a powerful force, were now fractured into factions, some eager to fight, others looking for any opportunity to secure their own power. A few, however, remained uncertain, torn between loyalty to the crown and their own ambitions. Lucian's thoughts were interrupted as the heavy doors to the war room swung open, revealing the familiar faces of his inner circle. Lady Alara, Lord Gavriel, and Aldrich were already gathered, their expressions grim. The air was thick with the weight of the decisions yet to be made. "Your Majesty," Aldrich began, his voice low, "the emissaries from the Darren tribes have arrived. They are waiting for you in the audience hall." Lucian sighed, his hand running through his hair. The Darren tribes were his kingdom's best chance for an ally in this war. Their warriors were formidable, and their loyalty could tip the balance in their favor. But they were also dangerous. Their history was one of conquest, not alliance, and their demands were steep. Land, resources, and most troublingly, a seat at the council. To grant them such power would mean bending the kingdom's sovereignty to their will. The political ramifications were far-reaching. "I'll meet with them," Lucian said, his voice steady, but the weight of the decision was evident in his eyes. "But we need to be careful. Aeliana was right. We cannot afford to lose control of the kingdom's future to these tribes." Aldrich nodded, understanding the gravity of Lucian's words. The Darren tribes were not to be underestimated, but their loyalty was also uncertain. If they sided with the Darnathians, or worse, betrayed Itharia, it could mean the kingdom's collapse. As Lucian made his way toward the audience hall, his thoughts turned inward. His father, King Elric, had always warned him that leadership was a balancing act, one that required more than just strength. It required the subtle art of negotiation, the understanding that sometimes the people you trusted the most could be the ones who turned against you. The relics his family had guarded for centuries were the key to Itharia's power, but they also represented its greatest danger. His ancestors had hidden them away for a reason. They were too powerful to fall into the wrong hands. But now, Lucian feared they were the very thing that could bring the kingdom to its knees. The audience hall was quiet as Lucian entered, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the stone floor. Sitting at the far end of the hall were the Darren emissaries, 3 men, tall and broad-shouldered, their faces etched with the scars of battle. Their attire was simple, but their presence was commanding. The air around them seemed to crackle with a kind of raw power, the kind that came from living on the edge of survival, day in and day out. Lucian stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his posture calm but alert. "Chieftains," he said, his voice firm, "I welcome you to Arianagar. I trust your journey was not too difficult." The tallest of the emissaries, a man with long black hair braided down his back, stood and gave a curt nod. "The road is always difficult, Your Majesty, but we have come with purpose." Lucian nodded, his mind already assessing the situation. "I have heard of your people's strength, and I recognize the power you hold. But our kingdom is in peril. The Darnathians threaten to overrun us, and if we do not stand united, we will fall." The emissary's eyes narrowed, but he held his tongue for a moment before speaking again. "We know of the Darnathians, but why should we fight for you, Lucian Vale? You offer us land, but you offer us nothing in return for the blood of our people. You ask us to fight a war not of our making." Lucian's heart tightened. This was the moment of truth. "I understand your concerns," he said, keeping his voice steady. "But Itharia is your ally in the east. If the Darnathians succeed, they will not stop here. Their ambition knows no borders. We are stronger together. In return for your aid, we offer protection, resources, and a permanent seat at the council. Your people will have a voice in the kingdom's future." The chieftain's gaze hardened. "A voice, yes. But what will you do if we ask for more? Power, land, influence, these are the things our people crave. Will you give them to us, or will we have to take them by force?" Lucian's jaw tightened, but he did not flinch. "The kingdom's sovereignty is not for sale," he said firmly. "But I offer you a partnership, a real alliance, one where you will have a seat at the table and where your people will be protected. But if you come to this table with demands that undermine the very foundation of this kingdom, I will not hesitate to defend what is mine." The chieftain studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "We will consider your offer, Lucian Vale. But be warned, our people do not take kindly to being controlled. We will fight with you, but we will not be your vassals." Lucian nodded, his heart sinking slightly. He had expected no less from the Darren tribes. But now that the path to alliance was open, he would have to walk a dangerous tightrope. If he bent too far, he might lose everything. As the Darren emissaries left the hall, Lucian couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Their demands, though not entirely unexpected, had only scratched the surface of their true intentions. The Darren chieftains wanted more than land. They wanted control, and their bloodlust would not be easily satisfied. Even as Lucian worked to secure their alliance, he couldn't help but wonder if they were truly allies, or if they were simply another faction vying for control of Itharia's throne. Meanwhile, Aeliana sat in her chambers, the weight of the kingdom's future pressing heavily on her shoulders. She had watched the negotiations with the Darren emissaries with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Her brother had made the right decision in seeking their support, but she could not shake the unease gnawing at her. Aeliana stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The streets were crowded with soldiers, merchants, and common folk, each of them uncertain of the future. The Darnathians were closing in, and every day the kingdom held on by a thread. She turned her gaze toward the citadel's heart, the vaults where the relics lay hidden. The power they contained was undeniable, but in the wrong hands, it could bring ruin. The Darnathians were only one threat. The greater danger, as Lucian had feared, lay within their own walls. The noble houses of Itharia were on the verge of civil war, and Aeliana knew that if her brother could not unite them, their kingdom would be lost, no matter how strong their military might. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned to find Lord Aldrich standing in the doorway, his face solemn. "Your Highness," he said, stepping inside. "There is news from the northern cities. The rebellion has grown worse. They are rallying under the banner of a new leader, one who calls himself the true king of Itharia." Galina's heart sank. The rebellion had taken root faster than even she had anticipated. Who is this leader? Aldrich hesitated before answering, his voice low. A man by the name of Kieran Valdar, a distant cousin to the Vale line. He claims to have the right to the throne. Alina's blood ran cold. Kieran Valdar. The name stirred something in her memory, an ancient claim to the throne, a bloodline that had been silenced long ago. And now, this rebel had risen, threatening to tear the kingdom apart from within. "Prepare the emissaries," Aeliana said, her voice cold. "We cannot let this man gain any more support. If he gathers enough followers, Itharia will be lost. Lucian's plans for the Darnathians will have to wait. We need to deal with this rebellion now, or there will be nothing left to defend." The tension in Arianagar had reached a boiling point. Lucian Vale stood on the balcony of his chambers, staring out across the city. The sky above was bruised with dark clouds, the air heavy with the threat of a coming storm. His mind was in turmoil. The war with the Darnathians was on the horizon, but a more insidious danger was already creeping within the heart of the kingdom, the rebellion led by Kieran Valdar. The northern cities had rallied to his cause, and now his movement had spread, like wildfire, threatening to destabilize everything Lucian had worked to protect. In the streets below, the soldiers of Itharia marched, preparing for the inevitable conflict. Merchants continued their business, but there was a palpable unease. Among the common folk, whispers of revolution and betrayal filled the air. Everywhere Lucian looked, he saw the cracks in the foundation of his kingdom, and every day those cracks seemed to widen. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Aeliana entered, her expression as resolute as ever. Her eyes, usually filled with sharp intelligence, were shadowed with the weight of the decisions that had been made, and the ones that still loomed ahead. "Lucian," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "we need to talk. The rebellion is growing stronger. Kieran Valdar is not just some rogue noble. He has support from every corner of the kingdom, military leaders, disgruntled lords, and the people, who feel abandoned by you." Lucian turned to face his sister, his jaw set in determination. "I know, Aeliana. We've been expecting this, but the timing couldn't be worse. The Darnathians are already on the move. If we split our forces now, we risk losing everything." Aeliana crossed the room and stood by the window, her gaze focused on the city below. "Lucian, we cannot ignore Kieran. If we allow him to gain more ground, we'll be fighting a two-front war. The Darnathians may be our immediate concern, but a rebellion like this will tear Itharia apart from the inside out." Lucian's eyes darkened. "So what do you propose, Aeliana? We can't afford to take on another war right now. I have already sent emissaries to the Darren tribes, and they've agreed to a tentative alliance. We need their warriors, their strength, and they'll want their price," Aeliana replied sharply. "I've spoken to their emissaries. They want control of the north, and they want a seat at the council. They won't fight for you without it. You may be able to buy them for a time, but the moment the war is over, they will turn on us. Itharia will become their prize, not our kingdom." Lucian sighed heavily. Aeliana was right. The Darren tribes were no allies. They were conquerors. But they were also necessary for the survival of the kingdom. He could not afford to ignore their demands, but at the same time, he knew the consequences of yielding to their power would be severe. The cost would be more than just land. It would be the soul of Itharia itself. "We will deal with them after the war," Lucian said firmly. "We cannot let their demands distract us now. We need to secure Itharia's survival first. If we don't, there will be no kingdom left to fight for." That evening, as the council gathered in the war room, Lucian could feel the weight of the decisions pressing down on him. The room, once a place of lively debate and strategy, now felt like a tomb. The fate of Itharia hung in the balance. The Darnathians were advancing, and Kieran Valdar's rebellion was spreading like wildfire. Lord Gavriel, The kingdom's top general stood at the head of the table, his expression grave. Your Majesty, the southern forces are ready to engage the Darnathians, but we need to make a decisive move. If we wait any longer, they will gain the upper hand. We must strike before they can fully consolidate their forces. Lucian nodded, though a deep unease settled in his chest. We will strike at dawn, Lord Gavriel. We will push the Darnathians back at the southern pass, using the terrain to our advantage. But we cannot afford to be divided. Aeliana is right. We cannot ignore the rebellion any longer. We need to address both threats at once. The room was silent for a moment. The generals and nobles exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to proceed. The rebellion in the north had already begun to gather momentum. Chiron's supporters had seized several key cities, and Lucian's control over the northern territories was slipping. We must send a force north to quash the rebellion, Aeliana said, her voice steady but filled with determination. We cannot. Let Chiron's claim to the throne stand. If we do, the kingdom will fracture beyond repair. Lord Aldrich, Lucian's most trusted advisor, spoke up from the corner of the room. A war on two fronts is risky, Your Majesty, but if we don't deal with Chiron, we risk losing the entire northern region. The lords there are already wavering in their loyalty. If Chiron is able to unite them under his banner, they will turn against us. Lucian met Aelina's eyes, the weight of their shared understanding settling over them. We must move swiftly. Aeliana, you will lead the northern campaign. You know the northern lords better than anyone. Work with the generals to quell the rebellion. I will take the southern forces to the pass and prepare for the Darnathian advance. Aeliana nodded, her expression unyielding. I won't fail you, Lucian. But I need to know, will you be able to hold the southern pass without us? Our forces are already stretched thin. Lucian hesitated for a moment. He knew the risks of splitting their forces, but he had no other choice. We will hold the pass, Aeliana. We have no other option. As the council meeting came to a close, Lucian retreated to his private chambers, his mind reeling with the decisions he had just made. The war was no longer just about defending Itharia from external threats. It was about the very future of the kingdom itself. The Darnathians, the rebellion, and the nobles. Each threat was linked, each one feeding off the other. His every choice would have repercussions, and Lucian feared that he had already made more enemies than allies. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Turning, he saw Lady Alara enter the room. Her face was pale, her expression tense. Your Majesty, she said, bowing low, I come bearing urgent news. The Eastern Lords have made their decision. Lucian straightened, his heart pounding in his chest. What news, Lady Alara? They've agreed to ally with us, she said, her voice steady but tinged with doubt. But only on one condition. They demand that the Darren tribe's influence in the north be limited. If they are to help us fight the Darnathians, they will not allow the Darren to take control of the northern trade routes. They want those routes reserved for their merchants. Lucian's mind raced as he processed the information. The Eastern Lords, known for their wealth and political savvy, had finally committed to the war effort, but their demands threatened to undermine the fragile alliance he had with the Darren tribes. Very well, Lucian said, his voice cold with resolve. We will honor their demands, temporarily. Once the Darnathians are defeated, we will reassess the situation. But for now, we cannot afford to lose their support. Lady Alara nodded, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. And what of the rebellion, Your Majesty? If we fail to contain it, the Eastern Lords may reconsider their allegiance. Lucian's gaze hardened. We will not fail. Aeliana will deal with the rebellion, and the Darnathians will be crushed. Itharia's future will not be stolen from us. As the war preparations intensified, Lucian found himself caught between two worlds, one of external threats and the other of internal decay. The future of Itharia hung by a thread, and the choices he made in the coming days would determine whether the kingdom would survive or collapse under the weight of its own division. The relics, long buried in the heart of the citadel, remained, the kingdom's greatest secret and its greatest danger. As Lucian prepared for the war ahead, he knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The kingdom's fate was no longer a matter of military might. It was a battle for the soul of Itharia itself. The first light of dawn cast a pale glow over the southern pass, a narrow corridor between the jagged mountains that separated Itharia from the Darnathian warbands advancing from the south. Lucian Vale stood at the head of his forces, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. The air was thick with tension, the smell of sweat and smoke clinging to the soldiers who lined up in formation. Their faces were grim, their eyes fixed on the looming mountains that hid the enemy from sight. Lucian's mind raced as he surveyed the scene. The Darnathians were known for their ferocity in battle, but he had the advantage of terrain. The narrow passes could be defended with fewer troops, and the mountains themselves would be a natural barrier against a full-scale attack. His plan was simple: hold the line at all costs, and buy time for the reinforcements from the north to arrive. But as the minutes ticked by, Lucian knew the situation was far more precarious than it seemed. "We're ready, Your Majesty, Lord," Gavriel said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "The southern legions are in position. We've sent scouts ahead to monitor the enemy's movements, but there's no sign of their main force yet." Lucian nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "We cannot wait for them to strike first. If they gain the initiative, they will overrun us. We must take the fight to them." At his side, Aeliana stood, her face set in a mask of determination. She had insisted on accompanying Lucian to the southern pass, despite the dangers. Her presence was both a comfort and a reminder of the fragile balance they had to maintain, an unspoken bond between them that, for all their differences, had kept the kingdom together in its darkest times. "You know the Darnathians better than any of us," Lucian said, turning to his sister. "What are we dealing with?" Alina's eyes were cold, calculating. "Sargon, their chieftain, is not one to underestimate. He's ruthless, and he will not back down easily. But his forces are a mix of warbands and mercenaries. They'll be unpredictable. We'll have to rely on speed and strategy. We can't engage them head-on in an open battle." Lucian nodded. He had known that their military strength alone wouldn't be enough to win. They needed cunning, not just brute force. "We'll use the mountain passes to our advantage. The Darnathians won't expect a full assault from our side. We'll take them by surprise." Hours passed in tense anticipation. The morning heat was stifling, the air thick with the promise of conflict. The soldiers moved with purpose, their movements synchronized and practiced. Lucian walked through their ranks, his mind heavy with the burden of leadership. His father had taught him that a king's strength was not in his sword or his crown, but in his ability to guide his people through the storm. And today, the storm would come. The sound of war horns echoed in the distance, and Lucian's heart leapt in his chest. The Darnathians were coming. It was time. "Positions!" Gavriel shouted, his voice commanding. "Form the line. We hold the pass, no matter what." Lucian took his place at the front of the formation, his sword drawn, his heart steady, but his mind racing. He had led battles before, but this was different. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. The survival of Itharia was on these. "Line!" A distant roar reached his ears, the unmistakable cry of the Darnathian warbands. The ground trembled beneath the sound of their charge, their footsteps like thunder as they closed in on the pass. Aeliana was beside him in an instant, her eyes sharp as ever. "We need to hold this position until nightfall," she said, her voice low but urgent. "If we can't force them back now, we risk losing everything." Lucian nodded, his grip tightening. On his sword. We'll hold, Aeliana. We'll make them bleed for every inch of ground. The battle began in earnest as the Darnathian warbands emerged from the shadows of the mountains, their weapons gleaming in the early morning light. They were a fearsome sight, muscular, barbaric, their faces painted with blood-red symbols of Va. War. Sargon's warriors roared as they charged, crashing against Lucian's line like a wave against the rocks. The ground shook beneath the fury of their attack, and for a moment, Lucian feared they might break through. But his soldiers held fast. The narrow pass worked in their favor, forcing the Darnathians to fight in a confined space. Lucian watched as his men fought with unmatched bravery, their swords flashing, their shields blocking the brutal onslaught. Every strike was a desperate bid for survival, every movement a prayer for victory. In the midst of the chaos, Lucian saw it. Sargon, the Darnathian chieftain, at the head of his warband, a hulking figure clad in fur and iron. His eyes gleamed with bloodlust, and his massive axe cleaved through the air with deadly precision. Lucian knew that this was the man who could destroy Itharia. He could not let him reach the front lines. "To me!" Lucian shouted, rallying his soldiers around him. "We take him down now." Aeliana, ever the strategist, was at his side in an instant, her sword raised high. "For Itharia!" she cried, her voice ringing out across the battlefield. Together, they charged toward Sargon. The battle around them was a blur of steel and blood, the cries of the wounded mixing with the thunderous clash of weapons. Lucian and Aeliana fought side by side, their movements fluid and synchronized. Lucian's sword met the Darnathian warriors with precision, cutting through their ranks as if they were nothing more than shadows. And then, in the heart of the storm, he saw him, Sargon, the brutal chieftain, a giant of a man with wild eyes and a blood-stained axe. Lucian's heart raced as he pushed his way through the battlefield, his focus narrowing to the Darnathian leader. This was the moment that would determine everything. Sargon turned toward him, a cruel smile twisting on his lips. "You think you can defeat me, little king?" he taunted, his voice booming above the noise of the battle. Lucian's response was swift. "I don't think, Sargon. I know." With a roar, the two clashed, their weapons meeting in a shower of sparks. Lucian's blade was quick, precise, but Sargon's strength was overwhelming. The Darnathian chieftain swung his axe with terrifying force, each strike capable of splitting a man in half. Lucian parried, barely keeping up, his arms aching from the effort. Alina's voice cut through the noise as she moved to flank Sargon. "Lucian, now? I've got him." With Alina's help, Lucian found his opening. He ducked beneath Sargon's wild swing, stepping in close and driving his sword upward into the chieftain's side. Sargon howled in pain, stumbling back, but he wasn't finished yet. His fury only seemed to grow stronger, and with one final desperate swing of his axe, he lunged at Lucian. But Lucian was faster. With a swift motion, he disarmed Sargon, sending the chieftain's axe flying from his grasp. Sargon fell to his knees, panting, blood streaming from his wounds. Lucian stood over him, his sword raised high. "For Itharia," Lucian whispered, his voice filled with grim resolve. And with that, he brought his blade down. The battle did not end with Sargon's death, but it was a turning point. The Darnathian warbands, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. It was enough for Lucian's forces to rally and push them back, forcing them into retreat. The southern pass had been held, at least for now, but the victory was bittersweet. The cost of the battle had been high. The southern legions had taken heavy losses, and the fields were littered with the bodies of the fallen. Lucian stood amidst the carnage, his sword dripping with blood, his heart heavy with the weight of the battle. The Darnathians had been repelled, but the war was far from over. Later that night, As the fires of the battlefield flickered in the distance, Lucian stood with Aeliana at the edge of the camp. The moon cast a pale light over the ruins of the fight, and for a moment the two siblings stood in silence, contemplating the cost of the war. "We've won the battle," Aeliana said softly, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "But the war is far from over." Lucian nodded, his eyes distant. "I know, and the worst part is yet to come." As the smoke of battle cleared, the kingdom of Itharia stood at a crossroads. The Darnathians had been pushed back, but the rebellion in the north was still gathering strength. Lucian knew that the true test of his leadership was just beginning. And as the relics, those ancient and dangerous artifacts, loomed ever closer, Lucian understood that the kingdom's fate was not just about surviving the war. It was about what would remain of Itharia once the dust had settled. The air was thick with smoke, the stench of burning flesh still lingering in the early morning light. The battlefield, once a place of violent clash and chaos, had begun to settle into a grim quiet. The Darnathian warbands had been forced into retreat, their leader Sargon felled by Lucian's blade. But the cost had been high. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, both Darnathian and Itharian. The sounds of mourning and preparation for burial filled the camp as soldiers and commanders alike worked in solemn silence to tend to the dead and wounded. Lucian stood near the edge of the camp, looking out over the battlefield. The horizon was still streaked with the fiery remnants of the conflict. His chest ached, not from the physical wounds of battle, but from the heavy weight of leadership. He had won the day, yes, but at what cost? "Aeliana," Lucian called, his voice heavy with exhaustion. His sister stepped beside him, her face hard, though her eyes betrayed a quiet sorrow. The battle had taken its toll on both of them. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Too many," she replied, her voice tight. "We've lost a quarter of our forces. The southern legions are wounded, but they'll survive. It's the aftermath we must contend with. The Darnathians may have retreated, but their threat remains." Lucian nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We've won this battle, but the war is far from over. The rebellion in the north is only growing stronger. And the Darren tribes, they'll want their reward for their loyalty. And that's a price I'm not willing to pay." Alina's eyes flickered with understanding. "The Darren tribe's demands are growing more insistent. And the Eastern Lords? They're already whispering about the relics. They know we've kept them hidden for too long." Lucian's hands tightened into fists. The relics, the ancient artifacts that had been passed down through generations of the Vale family, remained his kingdom's greatest weapon, but also its greatest risk. Hidden deep within the royal citadel, they were said to contain power beyond comprehension. And Lucian knew that if they fell into the wrong hands, they would spell Itharia's doom. "I won't let them fall into anyone's hands but ours," Lucian said firmly. "The relics must remain hidden, Aeliana. We can't allow the nobles, the tribes, or the Darnathians to take them. They would destroy the kingdom with that kind of power." Aeliana placed a hand on her brother's shoulder, her touch firm but filled with the weight of the moment. "I agree, but we can't fight everyone, Lucian. We need to find a way to unite the kingdom before we're torn apart by our own ambitions." Back in Arianagar, as the aftermath of the battle settled into the daily rhythm of the citadel, tensions were rising within the royal court. The news of the victory at the southern pass had spread like wildfire, but so had whispers of discontent. The nobles, who had long been divided, now faced the reality of Lucian's leadership. Some rallied behind him, but others, more opportunistic, saw the weakening of the monarchy as their chance to seize power for themselves. Lady Alara, ever the politically savvy noblewoman, entered Lucian's chambers with a solemn expression. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing slightly, "the situation in the capital is growing dire. The lords of the East are becoming increasingly vocal about their demands. They know that the Darnathians were pushed back, but they want assurances that the kingdom will remain open to their trade interests. Lucian's gaze hardened. And what of the Northern Rebellion? What news have you received from Aeliana's forces? Rebellion leaders are gaining ground, Your Majesty, Aeliana replied. Kirin Valdar's supporters are rallying in the north. The common folk are beginning to believe in his cause. They see him as the true heir to the throne. The lords in the northern cities are divided, and some are already sending word that they may align themselves with the rebel faction. Lucian clenched his jaw. The rebellion was not just a military threat. It was a political one as well. Kirin Valdar, claiming to be the rightful heir to the throne, had captured the loyalty of the northern lords, and now his rebellion threatened to split the kingdom in two. You're telling me that Kiron's rebellion is not just a military matter? Lucian asked, his voice low with frustration. Indeed, Your Majesty, Alara said. There are whispers that he has been gaining support from certain factions within the court as well. The rebellion is becoming a movement, not just a military struggle. Lucian's mind raced. Kiron's rebellion could not be allowed to spread any further. If it reached the southern lords, the kingdom would be torn apart. Yet, Lucian knew he couldn't wage war on two fronts. The Darnathians remained a serious threat, and his alliance with the Darren tribes was still fragile. I cannot fight both. The Darnathians and the rebellion at the same time, Lucian said, his voice thick with the weight of his thoughts. I need to secure the north. Aeliana will handle the military campaign, but we also need the support of the lords. If we cannot win their loyalty, Itharia will collapse. Later that evening, Lucian met with Aeliana in the quiet of his chambers. The weight of the day's decisions hung heavy in the air between them. She was already preparing to leave for the northern territories, where the rebellion was gaining strength, but Lucian knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. How is it, really? Lucian asked quietly, his eyes meeting Aelina's. How much time do we have before the rebellion spreads further? Aelina's expression was as hard as granite. We don't have time. The northern cities are already divided, and Kiron's message is resonating with the common folk. They believe he is their true king, and that the nobles, particularly from the south, have betrayed them. Lucian sighed. And what do we do, Aeliana? Do we crush them all, as my father would have done, or do we try to find a way to unite the kingdom again? Aelina's voice was soft, yet unwavering. I think we need to do both, Lucian, but we must be strategic. The rebellion won't end with military force alone. If we're going to defeat Kirin, we need the loyalty of the northern lords. If they rally behind us, we can end this without further bloodshed. Lucian's gaze softened as he looked at his sister. And what of the Darnathians? Do we turn our backs on them now? They are still a threat to Itharia. No matter what happens in the north, we fight them both, Aeliana said firmly. But we need to act quickly. The rebellion may take longer to quell, but the Darnathians are right at our doorstep. We can't allow either threat to consume us. As the days passed, Lucian's resolve was tested at every turn. The rebellion in the north continued to spread, while the Darnathian forces began regrouping. Lucian's military leaders were stretched thin, and he had to make tough decisions, balancing the need for reinforcements and the call for diplomacy. Every action he took seemed to open another avenue for potential betrayal. Every alliance came with its own price. The nobles in the eastern territories had grown more insistent in their demands for control, pushing for more land and influence. In exchange for their loyalty, the Darren tribes, while still pledged to the crown, had begun making their own demands, threatening to take control of the northern trade routes if their conditions were not met. And the relics, those ancient artifacts of untold power, remained hidden in the royal citadel, a secret that, if exposed, could alter the entire balance of power. Lucian knew that the coming days would be the most difficult of his life. He had won battles before, but this was different. The kingdom was fracturing, and every move he made seemed to bring him closer to the edge of losing everything. The Darnathians were a threat, but the rebellion within the kingdom was just as dangerous. And somewhere, lurking in the shadows, were the forces that sought to control the relics, the true power behind Itharia's throne. As Lucian looked out over the darkening skies of Aeliana, he understood the gravity of the situation. The kingdom was on the edge of destruction, and the choices he made now would determine whether Itharia could be saved, or whether it would be lost forever. The morning air in Aeliana was colder than Lucian had anticipated. As the sun rose over the eastern horizon, it bathed the city in a dim, gray light. The streets, which had once been full of bustling merchants and lively chatter, were eerily silent. The weight of the kingdom's uncertainty hung heavy over every corner of the capital. Lucian stood at the edge of the palace balcony, his gaze lost in the sea of rooftops below. His kingdom was fracturing. The rebellion in the north had only grown, more intense in recent days. Kirin Valdar's message was resonating with the common folk, the same people who had been oppressed by the nobility for generations. They saw in Kirin the embodiment of their frustrations and dreams for a better future. The northern lords, those who had long resented the central power of Aeliana, were wavering in their loyalty. Some had already pledged their allegiance to Kirin, believing him to be the rightful ruler of Itharia. Lucian had not expected the rebellion to spread so quickly, but in the wake of the Darnathian threat, the kingdom's divisions had become more pronounced, the fractures in Itharia's foundation widening with each passing day. He knew that the Darnathians were a serious threat, but the rebellion within the kingdom was an equally dangerous adversary. If the northern lords turned on him, Itharia would collapse from within. Aeliana entered the chamber, her expression as hard as steel. She had returned from her mission to the northern cities only a few hours ago, and her demeanor spoke volumes. "Lucian," she said, her voice laced with a mixture of frustration and resolve, "we need to act. The rebellion is growing, stronger by the hour. Kirin is uniting the northern lords, and they are beginning to rally behind his banner. If we wait any longer, we risk losing them altogether." Lucian turned to face her, his expression darkening. "I know, we've lost some ground in the north, but we cannot afford to split our forces. The Darnathians are still a pressing threat. They regrouped after their retreat, and they're preparing for another assault. If we move too quickly against the rebellion, we leave ourselves vulnerable." Alina's eyes narrowed. "I understand, but we cannot ignore the rebellion any longer. We are on the verge of losing the loyalty of the North. The Darnathians may not be able to defeat us immediately, but a civil war would tear us apart. And there are rumors the Darnathians may be secretly supplying Kirin with troops and weapons." Lucian's heart sank. If the Darnathians were indeed aiding Kirin, it would mean a strategic alliance between two forces that sought the destruction of Itharia's monarchy. A civil war on top of an invasion from the south would leave the kingdom powerless, and he could not afford to allow that to happen. "We need to secure the north first," Lucian said, his voice low but firm. "We'll have to make difficult choices. We can't afford to lose any more ground, but the Darnathians cannot be underestimated. I need you to take command of the northern forces, Aeliana. Gather our most loyal generals and deal with Kirin. We'll push him back before he gains too much power." Aeliana nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "And what of the Darnathians?" "I'll lead the defense at the southern pass," Lucian said, his voice steady. "The southern forces are still strong. We'll hold the pass as long as we can. But you must stop the rebellion before it spreads further." Aeliana hesitated, then spoke with a quiet but resolute voice. "And if Kirin refuses to stand down, If the rebellion grows too powerful, then we will crush it, no matter the cost, Lucian replied, his words laced with cold determination. I will not allow Itharia to fall into chaos. We will not be divided. Later that day, as Lucian prepared to meet with the Darren emissaries, the mood in Aeliana was tense. The city's walls, once symbols of defense, now seemed like fragile barriers against the storm that was brewing within and outside the kingdom. The Darren tribes had promised support, but their loyalty was questionable at best. They had been eager to join the fight against the Darnathians, but Lucian knew that the price for their allegiance was steep. The Darren chieftains were a powerful force, and their warriors would undoubtedly tip the balance in favor of Itharia. But at what cost? Lucian had already given them land and control over the northern trade routes, but their demands were becoming more insistent by the day. They wanted a say in the governance of Itharia, and Lucian's refusal to give them any more influence would likely push them toward the Darnathian alliance. As Lucian entered the Grand Hall to meet with the Darren emissaries, his thoughts were heavy with the consequences of their demands. The fate of the kingdom rested on the fragile alliance he had forged with the tribes, but every moment spent negotiating with them was a step closer to weakening his own rule. Your Majesty? The Darren chieftain greeted him with a deep bow. His voice was rough, the accent of his people thick, but his eyes were sharp, filled with the cunning that came with years of warfare. We have come to discuss the terms of our alliance. Our warriors are ready to fight, but the price we've agreed upon must be honored. Lucian remained standing, his posture stiff with the weight of his decision. I've honored every promise I've made to you, he replied, his voice calm but firm. But your demands are growing, and I fear that if I give you too much, I risk losing control of the kingdom. The chieftain's eyes glinted with amusement, but his tone remained steady. We are not your enemies, Lucian Vale. We fight for survival, just as you do. But we will not fight for a kingdom that refuses to acknowledge our power. I've given you control over the northern trade routes, Lucian said, his patience thinning. And I've promised you influence in the council. That is all I can offer. The chieftain stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Lucian's. You will offer us more, or we will walk. The Darnathians are waiting. If we turn to them for support, your kingdom will fall, and we will take what is rightfully ours. Lucian's jaw clenched. He had known this day would come, the day when the Darren tribes would push too hard, demanding too much. If he gave in, now it would mean the end of Itharia's sovereignty. But if he refused, they might turn their backs on him, leaving him exposed to both the Darnathians and the rebellion. You will not betray me, Lucian said, his voice low but filled with authority. If you do, I will not hesitate to defend my kingdom. You may have power, but you do not control Itharia. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, their gazes locked. Finally, the Darren chieftain nodded, his expression unreadable. We will honor our agreement, Your Majesty. But know this, the time will come when we will take what is ours, and we will not be denied. Lucian watched as the emissaries left, a sense of unease settling over him. He had secured their support for now, but the cost was more than he could bear. The Darren tribes would not be satisfied with land or power. They wanted control, and Lucian knew that sooner or later, their ambition would turn against him. As the days passed, Lucian and Aeliana's strategies began to take shape. The northern rebellion had spread further, but Aeliana was making progress in consolidating the loyal forces of the north. She had secured the support of several northern lords, but Chiron's forces remained a formidable adversary. The rebellion was not just a political challenge, it was a test of loyalty, and Lucian knew that every action he took would be scrutinized by both allies and enemies. The Darnathian forces, meanwhile, were regrouping, preparing for another attack on the southern pass. Lucian's troops were ready, but the situation was far from certain. His forces were spread thin, and the rebellion in the north threatened to drain their resources. If Itharia was to survive, Lucian would need to be more than just a king. He would need to be a master of both warfare and diplomacy, navigating the dangerous web of alliances, betrayals, and power struggles that threatened to tear his kingdom apart. The future of Itharia was in his hands, and Lucian knew that the decisions he made in the coming days would determine not just the survival of his kingdom, but the legacy he would leave behind. The night was heavy with the scent of smoke and the sound of distant drums. The campfires flickered across the battlefield like 1,000 tiny stars, their glow barely visible through the haze of the evening fog. Lucian Vale stood at the edge of the southern pass, staring out over the landscape as the weight of the past few days pressed down on him. The Darnathian forces were regrouping, and the rebellion in the north continued to grow stronger. With each passing hour, the kingdom slipped further into chaos. He had sent Aeliana to deal with the rebellion in the north, but even she could only do so much. Kirin Valdar's forces had been growing bolder by the day, and the northern lords who had once sworn fealty to the crown were now siding with the rebel leader. The whispers of a new king had spread across the northern cities, and soon the loyalty of the northern cities would be entirely lost. Lucian's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Lord Gavriel approaching, his armor still dusty from the day's skirmishes. The veteran general's face was etched with concern, his usual calm demeanor replaced with the strain of the campaign. "Your Majesty," Gavriel said, bowing his head slightly in respect. "The scouts report that the Darnathian warbands are moving faster than expected. We believe they plan to attack at dawn." Lucian's brow furrowed. "At dawn? I thought we had more time to fortify our position." "Their forces are smaller than ours, but they are relentless," Gavriel replied. "We may be able to hold the pass, but it will not be easy. Their main force is still several days out, but they're hoping to strike before we can reinforce the defenses." Lucian's mind raced. He had already stretched his forces thin by attempting to fight both the Darnathians and the rebellion. But if the Darnathians launched a full-scale attack on the pass, they could break through the defenses and destabilize the entire southern region. He needed to act quickly. He couldn't afford to lose the pass. "We will hold the pass," Lucian said with finality, his voice low but filled with determination. "Gather the troops. We won't let them take this land. And make sure the reinforcements from the east are on their way. We'll need every man we can get." Gavriel nodded and quickly departed, leaving Lucian alone with his thoughts once more. The weight of his responsibilities was becoming unbearable. The survival of Itharia rested on his shoulders, and yet the kingdom seemed to be slipping from his grasp. Every move he made, every decision, was a gamble. The Darnathians, the rebellion, the Darren tribes, the nobles, everyone was watching, waiting for a sign of weakness. Back in the heart of Arianagar, Aeliana paced restlessly in her chambers. The journey north had been grueling, and the rebellion was spreading faster than she had anticipated. Kiron's supporters were rallying to his cause, bolstered by promises of a new future free from the oppressive rule of the southern nobles. His message had found fertile ground among the common folk, who had long resented the inequality that ran rampant through the kingdom. Aeliana had seen it herself. Cities that had once been loyal to the crown were now simmering with rebellion. And even some of the northern lords, who had sworn allegiance to Lucian, were starting to waver. As Aeliana prepared to leave for another meeting with the northern lords, there was a soft knock at her door. She turned to see Lord Albric standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of concern and resolve. "Lady Aeliana," Aldrich said, stepping into the room. "There is word from the southern forces. The Darnathians are advancing faster than expected. The situation at the southern pass is critical. Aelina's face hardened. Then we must make our move. If we can quell the rebellion quickly, we can redirect forces to the south. We cannot let the Darnathians break through. Aldrich shook his head. The rebellion is not the only issue we face, my lady. There are rumors. Chiron's supporters are not just in the north. The Darnathians may be backing him. There are whispers that they are providing him with weapons and soldiers. Aelina's eyes narrowed. If Chiron is working with the Darnathians, it changes everything. We must move now, before it's too late. She turned to Aldrich, her voice cold and firm. Gather the generals. We march at first light. The rebellion ends now. At the southern pass, Lucian was already preparing for the impending battle. The sky was just beginning to lighten as the first rays of dawn broke over the mountains. His troops were lined up, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was to come. The tension was palpable, the sound of soldiers whispering among themselves barely, audible over the rhythmic beat of drums in the distance. The Darnathian warbands were coming, and they were coming fast. Lucian stood at the front of his forces, surveying the battlefield. The pass was narrow, with steep cliffs on either side, making it the perfect place to hold a defensive position. But it also left his forces vulnerable to a concentrated attack. The Darnathians had always been fierce in battle, and they had no mercy for those who stood in their way. The war horns sounded, a deep, resonant call that echoed across the pass. The Darnathians were here. Prepare for battle, Lucian commanded, his voice carrying across the ranks. His soldiers took their positions, gripping their weapons tightly. Lucian drew his sword, feeling the weight of it in his hand, the cold steel. A reminder of the sacrifices he had made, and the sacrifices yet to come. Aelina's voice rang out behind him, her words filled with purpose. We will hold the line, Lucian. Together. The ground trembled beneath the force of the Darnathian charge. Lucian's heart raced as the enemy emerged from the mist. A wall of brutality and bloodlust. The battle began in an instant, crashing against the Etherian defenses like a storm. The roar of battle filled the air, the sounds of steel on steel, the cries of warriors as they fought for their lives. Lucian fought with everything he had, his sword moving in a blur as he cut down enemy after enemy. But the Darnathians were relentless, their warriors fierce and unyielding. Lucian could feel the pressure mounting as the enemy closed in. The southern pass was the last line of defense, and if it fell, the kingdom would be vulnerable. His soldiers were holding strong, but their numbers were dwindling, and the Darnathians were pressing forward. Lucian's mind raced as he considered their options. He had to hold the line. He had to buy time for the reinforcements from the east to arrive. We can't hold them forever, Lord Gavriel shouted, his voice strained as he fought beside Lucian. We need more time. Lucian's eyes searched the battlefield, desperate for a solution. And then he saw it, an opening, a narrow gap between two enemy units. If he could break through, he could flank their forces, cut off their retreat, and turn the tide of the battle. Without hesitation, Lucian gave the command. Charge! Break their lines! The sound of hooves pounding the earth echoed as Lucian led the charge, cutting through the Darnathian warbands like a knife through butter. The soldiers behind him followed with a fierce determination, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the battle might turn in their favor. The Darnathians were caught off guard, their ranks disarrayed as Lucian's forces struck from behind. But just as victory seemed within reach, a sudden roar split the air. The Darnathian chieftain, a hulking figure covered in scars and tattoos, appeared at the front of the battlefield. His eyes were filled with rage as he rallied his troops for a final push. Hold the line, Lucian shouted, rallying his soldiers. We can win this. But as the Darnathian chieftain charged, Lucian's world seemed to slow. He knew that this battle, this moment, would determine the fate of Etharia. and the stakes were higher than ever before. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a blood-red hue over the battlefield as the last remnants of the Darnathian warbands fled into the distance. The southern pass had been held, but at a heavy cost. The battlefield was littered with the dead, and the wounded, both Itharian and Darnathian, testament to the ferocity of the fight. Smoke still curled up from the remains of burning wagons and tents, and the air was thick with the stench of blood and charred earth. Lucian Vale stood at the edge of the pass, his eyes scanning the carnage before him. His armor was dented and bloodied, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. His sword hung loosely by his side, its once glimmering blade now dark with the marks of battle. Though they had won the day, the victory felt hollow. The price of survival was steep. Beside him, Lord Gavriel surveyed the battlefield with a grim expression. The general's armor was battered, and his voice was heavy with fatigue. "Your Majesty, the Darnathians have been pushed back, but their forces are not defeated. They will regroup, and they will return." Lucian's jaw tightened. He had known this would be a temporary victory. The Darnathians were a relentless foe, and their thirst for conquest would not be quenched by a single defeat. Yet the southern pass was still standing, and for now, the kingdom remained protected. "Gather the wounded," Lucian ordered. "We'll need to send word to Aeliana. She need to know the situation here. If the rebellion in the north grows stronger, we may need to shift our focus." Gavriel nodded, but there was no joy in the movement. "And what of the northern rebellion, Your Majesty? What should we do if we lose the north entirely?" Lucian's heart sank at the thought. The rebellion was the one threat he could not ignore. Kiran Valdar's forces had been growing bolder by the day, and the northern lords, once loyal to the crown, were now rallying to the rebel leader's cause. Aeliana had been sent to quash the rebellion, but even her tactical brilliance would be tested by the rebellion's spread. "We will send reinforcements to Aeliana," Lucian said, his voice firm. "But if Kiran's forces take the northern cities, we will have no choice but to fight a war on two fronts. We cannot allow the rebellion to grow any stronger." Later that evening, in the war tent, Lucian met with his senior commanders to discuss their next move. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting long shadows on the stone walls. The atmosphere was heavy, weighed down by the decisions that needed to be made. Every choice felt like a gamble, one that could determine the survival of the kingdom. "We've sent scouts to the north, but the reports are inconsistent," Lord Gavriel said, his brow furrowed. "Some say the rebellion is close to taking Nevria, while others claim the northern lords are still holding out." Elena's absence at the table was a silent reminder of the stakes. The rebellion was hers to deal with, but Lucian couldn't afford to wait for her response. If Kiran's forces were indeed gaining ground, the situation could become dire. Within days. "We'll wait for Elena's report," Lucian said, his voice resolute. "But we cannot ignore the possibility that we'll have to take decisive action in the north soon. If we lose the northern cities, we lose the kingdom." A long silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the corner of the tent. Lucian could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. His generals were waiting for him to make the call, but the uncertainty of the situation made every decision feel like a gamble. They had won at the southern pass, but the price of that victory had left them vulnerable to a new threat, the threat of disunity within their own ranks. "And the Darnathians?" Lord Gavriel asked, his voice low. "What of them? Their forces may have been pushed back today, but we both know they won't stay down for long." Lucian turned toward Gavriel, his eyes hard with resolve. "We will hold the southern pass. We cannot afford to give them a foothold in the south. Our forces are weakened, but we will fortify the pass and delay them as long as we can. We need to buy time for reinforcements, and time to deal with the rebellion." Gavriel nodded. though the worry in his eyes was unmistakable. Time is a luxury we no longer have. At the same time, in the northern reaches of Itharia, Aeliana had arrived at Nevria, the largest of the northern cities. The city was a stronghold, a symbol of the North's loyalty to the crown, but now it was teetering on the edge of rebellion. As Aeliana entered the city gates, she was met by a somber procession. The northern lords had gathered in the council hall, their faces filled with worry and indecision. The rebellion had already taken root in Nevria, and Chiron's supporters were gaining ground by the hour. Aelina's sharp eyes scanned the room as she stepped forward. The northern lords had always been proud, their loyalty often earned through promises of land, wealth, and power. But now, in the face of rebellion, those promises were empty. The city was divided, and Aeliana could feel the tension in the air, like the prelude to a storm. "My lady," Lord Edric, the head of the northern lords, greeted her, though his tone was cautious. "You've arrived at a difficult time. The people here are torn between loyalty to the crown and the promises of Kirin Valdar. He speaks of a kingdom where the common folk are treated fairly, where the nobles no longer control their lives." Alina's eyes narrowed as she took a seat at the council table. "And what of your loyalty, Lord Edric? Are you prepared to turn your back on your king, just because a rebel speaks of fairness?" Lord Edric sighed, his face weary. "It is not so simple, Lady Aeliana. The common folk have suffered for too long. They see in Kirin someone who promises change, who promises a better future, and many of the lords in the north have already aligned themselves with him." Alina's voice hardened. "And if you join him, you'll be turning your back on the kingdom you've sworn to protect. What will be left of Itharia if you allow the rebellion to tear it apart from within?" Lord Edric hesitated, his eyes flickering with doubt. "I'm not sure anymore, Lady Aeliana. The kingdom is fractured, and Chiron's message is too powerful to ignore." Aeliana stood, her gaze piercing. "You will not allow this rebellion to succeed. If you are truly loyal to the crown, you will fight for it. If not, you are no better than the rebels who seek to tear us apart." As the hours passed, Alina's efforts to rally the northern lords fell on increasingly deaf ears. Chiron's rebellion had already infiltrated the hearts and minds of the people, and many of the lords who had once pledged their fealty to Lucian were now swayed by promises of change. But Aeliana knew the truth, that Chiron's rebellion was not the answer. It was a poison that would destroy everything they had worked for. In the dead of night, as Aeliana prepared to leave Nevria for the next city, a messenger arrived with news that would change everything. The rebellion had spread beyond the northern cities. Now, the lords of the eastern provinces were beginning to waver. They, too, had been swayed by the promises of a new kingdom under Chiron's rule. Itharia was on the brink of collapse, and Aeliana realized that the kingdom's future was no longer just a matter of military might. It was a matter of trust, loyalty, and the very soul of the kingdom itself. Back at the southern pass, Lucian stood on the battlefield, watching the last of the Darnathian forces retreat into the mountains. The battle had been won, but the cost was steep. The kingdom had survived another day, but Lucian knew the war was far from over. His forces were exhausted, and reinforcements were still days away. But it was the rebellion in the north, the betrayal, within their own ranks, that gnawed at him. Itharia was breaking apart, and Lucian knew that the time had come to make a choice. He would either unite the kingdom through force, or he would lose it forever. The darkness of the night had settled over Arianagar, thick and suffocating, as Lucian paced back and forth in his private chambers. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him like an iron mantle. The kingdom of Itharia was on the brink of collapse. The southern pass had been held, but the Darnathians were regrouping. The rebellion in the north was spreading faster than anticipated, and every moment he spent in Arianagar only seemed to drive the kingdom further toward ruin. Lucian's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock at the door. He turned, his jaw tight, as the figure of Lord Aldrich entered. The elder advisor's face was drawn, his expression grim. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said quietly, his tone betraying a sense of urgency. "There is news from the north. Aeliana has sent word. Chiron's rebellion has taken hold in several key cities. The northern lords are rallying to his banner, and he's gaining more support by the day." Lucian's heart clenched. The rebellion had spread faster than he could have imagined, and now the loyalty of the northern lords was in jeopardy. If Chiron's forces gained the full support of the north, it would divide the kingdom irreparably. The rebellion was no longer just a political threat. It was an existential one. "What else?" Lucian asked, his voice cold as he turned to face Aldrich fully. "Several of the eastern lords have begun to distance themselves from your rule." Aldrich replied, his voice low. "They fear the rebellion will reach their lands, and are looking for a way to protect themselves. There are rumors that some of them are considering an alliance with Chiron, offering him their loyalty in exchange for his protection." Lucian's fists clenched, his frustration rising. "This kingdom is crumbling before my eyes. We fought the Darnathians, but the real war is happening within our walls. I cannot hold Itharia together if it's torn apart by its own people." Aldrich gave a small nod of understanding. "The kingdom is fractured. Your Majesty? The northern cities are already in chaos, and the eastern lords are beginning to sway. If we cannot unite the people soon, we risk losing everything." Lucian's mind raced as he thought about the choices before him. He could not afford to ignore the rebellion, but he also couldn't risk alienating the nobles who still supported him. His options were growing fewer by the hour. "What of the Darren tribes?" Lucian asked. "Their loyalty is shaky at best, but they could tip the balance of power in our favor. Have we received any further word from them?" Aldrich hesitated for a moment before responding. "The Darren chieftains have been demanding more. They want not just land, but influence in the kingdom's future. If we don't meet their demands, they may turn against us, or worse, join Chiron's rebellion." Lucian cursed under his breath. The Darren tribes, who had promised support, were now nothing more than another problem to be dealt with. Their demands were growing more insistent, and their loyalty was as fragile as ever. But if he gave them too much, he risked losing the entire kingdom to their control. "I will not be a puppet to the Darren tribes," Lucian said, his voice cold with resolve. "We will not bargain away Itharia's sovereignty, but if we're to hold the kingdom together, we need to find a way to neutralize the rebellion and secure the loyalty of the nobles. I can't do this alone." Aldrich bowed his head. "The path ahead is uncertain, Your Majesty, but you are not alone. The loyalty of your people still stands, though it is being tested." Lucian exhaled sharply, his thoughts heavy with the weight of leadership. "I won't let Itharia fall, not while I still draw breath." In the northern cities, Aeliana was facing the full force of Chiron's rebellion. The northern lords had rallied to his side, and the streets of Nevria had become a battleground. Chiron's message had taken root among the people, and the city, once a stronghold of loyalty to the crown, was now a hotbed of dissent. Aeliana rode through the streets of Nevria, her gaze steely and determined. Her forces were still loyal, but they were outnumbered. She had managed to hold the city for now, but the pressure was mounting. The rebellion was growing stronger, and time was running out. As she reached the city's central square, she was met by Lord Edric, the leader of the northern lords. His face was lined with concern, his once loyal demeanor now filled with uncertainty. "My lady," Edric said, bowing respectfully, "the time has come to choose. Chiron's rebellion is no longer just a movement. It is a revolution. His forces are gaining ground, and many of the lords are swearing their loyalty to him. I fear that if we do not act quickly, we will lose Nevria, and the rest of the north will follow. Aelina's eyes narrowed. And what of your loyalty, Lord Edric? Have you turned your back on your king as well? Edric hesitated, his gaze faltering for a moment. My loyalty is to the people of the north. Lady Aeliana, they are the ones who have suffered under the weight of your brother's rule. Kieran promises them a better future. But if you and your forces are willing to stand with us, I will rally the remaining lords. Together, we can push Kieran back and restore order to the north. Alina's expression hardened. You think Kieran is the answer? He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. If you follow him, you will destroy everything we've built. Itharia is one kingdom, and it cannot be divided. Lord Edric shook his head. I cannot ignore the will of the people, Lady Aeliana. The people are with Kieran now, and if you wish to save this kingdom, you will have to choose whether to stand with him or fight him. Alina's heart ached at his words. She had fought for her brother's cause for so long, and now it seemed as if everything was unraveling. The rebellion in the north was not just a political challenge. It was a battle for the soul of Itharia, and if she failed, the kingdom would be lost. I will not let Kieran destroy what my brother and I have built, Aeliana said, her voice steady. We fight him, and we fight for Itharia. The rebellion will end here. Today, back in Arianagar, Lucian sat alone in the war room, surrounded by the reports from both the north and south. His heart felt heavy with the choices that lay ahead. The Darnathians were regrouping, and the rebellion was spreading like wildfire. It seemed as if every move he made only created new enemies, and the kingdom he had sworn to protect was slipping further from his grasp. He had already made the decision to hold the southern pass, but it was a temporary victory. If the Darnathians regrouped, they would strike again. The rebellion in the north was no different. The forces of Kieran were gaining strength, and the kingdom was being torn apart from the inside. The throne that Lucian had inherited from his father seemed like a distant memory. The weight of leadership was heavier than he had ever imagined, and he knew that the choices he made in the coming days would define not just his reign, but the future of Itharia. Your Majesty, Aldrich's voice broke through the silence. The lords are gathering. They wish to meet with you. Lucian rose to his feet, his face hard with determination. Let them in, he said, his voice cold but resolute. It's time to decide the future of Itharia. The air in Arianagar was thick with anticipation. Every corner of the citadel buzzed with activity, the sound of soldiers marching, blacksmiths hammering weapons, and the hurried steps of servants tending to their duties. The kingdom, once full of pride and purpose, now seemed to carry the weight of its own impending collapse. Lucian Vale stood in the war room, staring at the maps spread before him, each line representing a point of contention, each red mark a symbol of blood spilled. In the name of survival, the Darnathian threat still loomed, their warbands massing to the south, while the northern rebellion continued to grow. Kieran Valdar's forces were no longer just a fringe group of discontented lords. They were a full-fledged army with the eyes, support of the common folk who had been promised a better future under his rule. Every day, the rebellion spread to new cities, and the once loyal northern lords were being torn between their allegiance to the crown and the temptation of Kieran's promises. Lucian's mind raced as he surveyed the reports. He had fought for years to protect Itharia, but now, for the first time, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting to preserve a kingdom. He was fighting for the very soul of the land. Your Majesty, Lord Gavriel's voice cut through his thoughts. The southern forces are ready. The Darnathians are advancing, and we've fortified the pass as much as we can. But we'll need to move soon, before they breach our defenses. Lucian nodded, but didn't speak immediately. He knew that the battle at the southern pass would be one of the most critical moments of the war. If the Darnathians broke through, they would have an open path to Aeliana, and if they succeeded, it could mean the fall of the kingdom. But that was only one part of the struggle. The rebellion in the north was no less pressing. If he didn't act quickly, Chiron's forces would tear the kingdom in two, and Itharia's future would be lost. "I'll take command of the southern forces," Lucian said, his voice resolute. "We'll hold the pass, no matter the cost. But Aeliana must stop. The rebellion in the north. We cannot afford to lose Nevria, and we cannot allow Chiron to gain more power." Gavriel nodded, though the concern in his eyes was unmistakable. "We can hold the pass, Your Majesty, but the rebellion. Chiron is more than just a political threat. If he unites the north, it will be impossible to recover. The lords are already divided, and many of them are looking for a way out. If Chiron wins their loyalty, we'll be fighting a war on two fronts." Lucian's jaw tightened. "I know. But if we don't stop Chiron now, the rebellion will consume us. Aeliana has to make her move, and she must win the northern lords to our side." Meanwhile, in the northern territories, Aeliana stood at the gates of Nevria, the city's skyline barely visible through the haze of smoke that hung in the air. Her forces had successfully retaken several small cities from Chiron's supporters. But the rebellion's grip on the north was tightening. The people were rallying behind Chiron, believing his promises of a better future, one that removed the stranglehold of the southern nobility. The northern lords were divided, some swearing allegiance to Chiron, while others still held fast to their loyalty to the crown. But time was running out. Aeliana knew that if she didn't act decisively, the north would slip away from them entirely. Her army was positioned outside Nevria, the capital of the northern provinces. The city had always been a symbol of the north's loyalty, but now it was a hotbed of rebellion. Chiron's forces were gathering within the city's walls, preparing for a siege that would tip the scales in their favor. As Aeliana paced back and forth outside the war tent, her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lord Edric, the leader of the northern lords, who had once pledged loyalty to Lucian. His face was grim as he approached, his voice carrying the weight of the decision that lay ahead. "My lady," Edric began, bowing low but with hesitation in his movements, "the time has come to make a choice. The people are with Chiron. If we don't support him, we risk losing their trust, and the rebellion will be unstoppable. You know as well as I do that Itharia is on the brink of collapse." Alina's eyes flashed with determination. "I know exactly what is at stake, Lord Edric, and I will not allow Chiron's rebellion to destroy Itharia. He is not the future of this kingdom. He is the destruction of it. His promises are empty, and his rebellion is built on lies." Edric shook his head, his face weary. "The people believe in him, Lady Aeliana. They believe he will bring change to the kingdom. And the lords, many of them, are already swearing allegiance to him." "Then they are betraying their king," Aeliana replied sharply. "I will not let the north be torn apart by the whims of a false king. We must fight, Lord Edric, and we must win." Edric's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I understand your loyalty to the crown, Lady Aeliana, but loyalty is not enough when the very foundation of our kingdom is crumbling. If we lose Nevria, we lose the north. And if we lose the north, we lose Itharia." Aeliana stood tall, her voice unwavering. "Then we will not lose Nevria. We will fight for it, and we will win. But we need the support of those who still stand with us. I will rally the northern lords, and we will strike Chiron down before his rebellion spreads further." Back in Aeliana, Lucian prepared to lead his forces into the southern pass. The air was heavy with the promise of conflict, and the sound of soldiers preparing for battle echoed throughout the citadel. Lucian knew that his forces were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of terrain. The pass was narrow, and they could use the mountain to their advantage. But as he stood at the front of the forces, his thoughts turned once more to the north. Aeliana was the key to winning the war, and if she could quell the rebellion, it would secure their position. But Lucian also knew that time was not on their side. If the rebellion reached Aeliana, it could be the final blow to Itharia's sovereignty. He turned to Lord Gavriel, his face hard with determination. "We hold the pass, no matter what it takes. We cannot afford to lose this position." Gavriel nodded, his face a mirror of Lucian's resolve. "We will hold, Your Majesty. But you must prepare for the possibility that the rebellion will not end so easily. Kiran is not a man who will back down, and the northern lords are already divided. If Aeliana does not succeed, we will have no choice but to take decisive action." Lucian's eyes hardened. "Then we will not fail. Aeliana will bring the north to heel, and we will fight to keep the kingdom united." As the battle at the southern pass began, the forces of Itharia faced the full might of the Darnathian warbands. The clash of steel, the cries of soldiers, and the roar of the enemy were deafening. Lucian fought at the front, his blade cutting through the Darnathians with precision and strength. His soldiers followed his lead, holding the line with everything they had. But even as they fought valiantly, Lucian knew that their victory at the pass was only a temporary reprieve. The rebellion in the north was growing stronger, and the future of Itharia hung in the balance. With every swing of his sword, Lucian realized that this was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the soul of his kingdom. The air in Aeliana was still, as if holding its breath. The distant rumble of drums echoed from the south, signaling the Darnathians' continued assault at the southern pass. To the north, Aeliana had succeeded in rallying the loyal northern lords, but the rebellion had not been extinguished. Kiran Valdar's forces were retreating, but only just. Each victory felt more like a battle won in vain, with more enemies rising in the wake of every setback. Lucian Vale stood on the balcony of the citadel, his gaze sweeping over the city below. The once thriving capital now felt more like a dying heart, its pulse slowing with every passing hour. The southern forces had held the line, but the threat of a Darnathian counterattack loomed large. In the north, the rebellion had not yet been quelled. There was still a simmering unrest among the people, and many lords remained loyal to Kiran's vision of a new kingdom, one that was unshackled from the tyranny of the southern nobility. The weight of the crown felt heavier than ever. Lucian's fingers gripped the railing, the chill of the stone seeping into his bones. Every choice he made now seemed to come with a price. To survive, Itharia needed unity, but it was unclear if that was even possible anymore. Aeliana approached, her face set in a grim mask of determination. Her time in the north had taken its toll, and the once vibrant energy she had carried into battle now felt dimmed by the heavy burden of leadership. But her resolve was unmistakable. As she stepped beside her brother, Lucian could sense the storm within her. "I've spoken with the northern lords," Aeliana said quietly. "They are not fully behind us yet. Kiran's influence still holds sway over many. The rebellion is not over, but we've driven him back, for now." Lucian turned to her, his eyes hard with the weight of the moment. "And we push forward. We must finish what we've started. The Darnathians are a pressing threat, but the rebellion in the north is a ticking time bomb. If we don't secure the loyalty of the northern lords and eliminate Kiran's forces, we risk losing everything." Alina's gaze softened slightly, but her tone remained resolute. "I agree, but the lords in the north are not like the ones in the south. They have their own ambitions. If we fight Kiran's rebellion, we risk alienating them further." Lucian nodded. "I understand, but we cannot allow the kingdom to splinter. If we let the rebellion fester, we risk losing both the north and the South, we need to take decisive action before it's too late. In the heart of the citadel, the War Council convened in the dimly lit hall. The heavy wooden table stretched between the commanders, generals, and the trusted members of the royal court. Every face was grim, every voice low with the realization that their kingdom was hanging by a thread. Lucian and Aeliana sat at the head of the table, their faces reflecting the toll of the ongoing conflict. Lord Gavriel, a seasoned general, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Your Majesty, we've held the pass, but our forces are depleted. The Darnathians may retreat, but we know they will strike again. We've managed to secure the loyalty of the southern legions, but we have fewer soldiers with each passing day." Lucian's voice was steady, but strained. "Then we'll fight harder. If we cannot hold the pass, we'll fight them elsewhere. The southern cities must remain in our hands. I won't let the Darnathians breach the heart of Itharia." Aeliana spoke. Next, her eyes sharp with determination. "And what of the rebellion in the north? Kieran is still a threat. We cannot leave the northern lords in limbo. If we don't neutralize Kieran's forces completely, they will keep rallying behind him." Lord Edric, one of the northern lords who had been swayed by Kieran, stood from his seat, his voice hesitant but filled with a sense of urgency. "Kieran's rebellion has taken hold in the hearts of the people. They believe he is their savior, the one who will free them from the rule of the nobles. If you wish to defeat him, you must offer the North more than just promises. You must show them a new path, one where the North has power." Lucian's gaze turned cold. "And what do you expect? Me to offer Lord Edric land? Influence? We are on the brink of war, and the kingdom is barely holding together. I cannot afford to divide it further." Edric met his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking for more power for myself. I'm asking for a future where the North isn't ruled by the Southern elite. If you give the people of the North a voice, if you show them that the crown is willing to share power, they will follow you." Aeliana stepped forward, her voice sharp. "We cannot reward rebellion. If we give in to Kieran, we lose everything we fought for. The kingdom will be torn apart." Edric's eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and conviction. "Then you risk losing the North entirely. You must choose, Lady Aeliana, your Majesty. If you continue down this path of strict monarchy, you will alienate the very people you wish to protect, and Kieran will be the one who wins." Lucian and Aeliana exchanged a long, quiet look. The decision was no longer just about military strategy. It was about the very heart of Itharia. Would they hold the kingdom together by force, or would they risk compromise in the hopes of uniting the kingdom for a future? After a long moment, Lucian spoke, his voice filled with a new sense of determination. "The rebellion must end. I will not allow Itharia to fall into chaos. But if we are to survive, we need to offer the northern lords a stake in the future of this kingdom. I will grant them power, but only if they swear loyalty to the crown. If they do not, we will crush the rebellion, and the rebellion will be the last one they ever see." Aelina's expression softened, though there was still uncertainty in her eyes. "You would compromise the monarchy for the sake of unity?" Lucian's face hardened with resolve. "Sometimes compromise is necessary to preserve what matters most. The kingdom is more important than any individual. If we fight for our power alone, we will lose it. We fight for Itharia's future, not for our own." The next few days were a blur of negotiation and military preparation. Lucian and Aeliana sent emissaries to the northern lords, offering them a place at the table, a voice in the future of the kingdom. The offer was met with mixed reactions. Some lords saw it as a sign of weakness, while others began to see it as a way forward. The rebellion had been a catalyst for change, but that change could either save or destroy Itharia. As Lucian prepared for the final battle at the southern pass, he felt a sense of finality in the air. This battle, This war would decide whether Itharia would remain whole or shatter into pieces. The cost of victory had already been high, but the cost of failure would be immeasurable. On the eve of the final assault, Lucian stood alone in his chamber, his sword in hand. The weight of his father's crown felt heavier than ever before. The decisions he had made, each one, had led to this moment. His kingdom was on the line, and the road ahead was uncertain. But in that moment, Lucian knew that there was no turning back. The kingdom he loved was at a crossroads, and the choices he made would either lead to its rebirth or its end. The final battle at the southern pass was a brutal one, but Lucian and his forces held strong. The Darnathans, though fierce, were repelled, and with their retreat, the southern region was secured. Meanwhile, Aelina's swift action in the north quelled the rebellion, forcing Kirin Valdar and his remaining supporters to flee. The northern lords, though still divided, saw the strength of the crown and pledged their loyalty once more. In the aftermath, Lucian and Aeliana stood together in the war room, looking out over a kingdom that was battered but not broken. Itharia had survived the storm, but the price had been high. The rebellion had forced them to reconsider the monarchy's rigid structure, and though the nobility still held power, there was a new understanding, one where the North had a voice, and the crown would no longer ignore the people. Lucian, weary but resolute, placed the crown back on his head. This kingdom is not just mine, Aeliana. It belongs to all of Itharia, every city, every village, every person. We fight for them, not for ourselves. Aeliana nodded, her gaze unwavering. We've learned that unity comes with sacrifice, Lucian. But now, the kingdom has a chance to rebuild. Together. As the new day broke over Arianagar, the first light of a new era shone upon Itharia. The kingdom, though scarred, had endured. The future was uncertain, but hope had returned. And as long as they remained united, the kingdom would rise again.